Welcome to Personal Landscapes. I'm your host, Ryan Murdoch. You can find links for today's episode and other conversations on Books About Place at ryanmurdoch.com. Today I'm speaking with Tom Parfitt. Tom walked across the northern flank of the Russian Caucasus, from the Black Sea to the Caspian Sea, through republics whose names are synonymous with violence, extremism, and warfare. He wanted to understand how places like Chechnya and Dagestan became crucibles of personal and national trauma. His book, High Caucasus, is a fascinating read that explores a part of the world I knew very little about. We spoke about the Circassians, mass relocations under Stalin, and high mountain villages where resourceful people have survived for centuries on the stoniest of ground. I hope you enjoy our conversation. I suppose we should start by orienting listeners unfamiliar with this part of the world. So, where are the Caucasus? What was your route, and why did you decide to walk across them?
The Caucasus is the area between the Black Sea and the Caspian. And my book is about the North Caucasus, which is the part which is entirely inside Russia on the northern flanks of the mountains. So effectively, the spine of the Greater Caucasus mountain range forms the border between Russia and former Soviet Georgia and Azerbaijan. So I was passing through the North Caucasus republics, which are constituent parts of Russia, the Russian Federation, and that's places like Adygea, Karachay-Cherkessia, Kabardino-Balkaria, North Ossetia, Ingushetia, Chechnya, Dagestan. So there's probably a distance of about 450 miles as the crow flies, but because of what one of my friends calls the wiggle factor when you're walking, and I had to take several kind of quite long detours and things, it added up to about 1,000 miles to walk. Yeah, and so the walk I undertook in 2008, and that was 4 years after I'd reported. I'm a correspondent now and was in the past for 20 years a correspondent in Russia for British newspapers. And I'd reported in 2004 on the Beslan school siege. I imagine a lot of your listeners will remember that. It was a terrible moment when several dozen Islamist militants, mostly Chechens and Ingush, seized a school in the neighboring majority Christian Republic of North Ossetia on the first day of school, September the 1st, and they took hostage the 1,000 or so, or 1,100 or so pupils and teachers and parents who were there to celebrate the day. It's a big day in the Russian calendar. People will come to celebrate on the first day of school. And they were herded into the gym by these militants, the hostages, and then the militants rigged it up with explosives. And there was a 3-day siege, effectively. The hostages were inside. They were not given much water or food to drink. It was obviously a terrible situation for the relatives who were outside, desperate to try and do something to help their relatives inside, but not able to do anything really. And then there were the security forces, the Russian security forces and soldiers outside, and also many local vigilantes who had weapons. And in the end, on the third day, there were a couple of explosions in the gym. No one quite knows how that happened, but that triggered a firefight between the militants inside the school who retreated further into the school and the security forces and the vigilantes outside. And then the roof caught fire as well of the gym where the hostages were held. So this combination of the explosions and the shooting and the fire ended up with more than 300 of the hostages being killed, and the majority of them children, about 185, I think. And so I was there as a reporter. And obviously, these things is 1,000 times worse for the people involved, the people who were in the gym who survived, and the relatives of those who were killed and injured. That's quite obvious, but it's also quite a distressing thing as a reporter. And after that, I had a recurring dream for several years about seeing a woman collapse at the moment she was told that her child had been killed at the school. She was outside the hospital, and that came back to me quite regularly for those years, just this moment of her tumbling to the ground. And so after 3 or 4 years, I struck on this idea of walking across the North Caucasus, because I thought that was perhaps a way that I could somehow kind of dilute the bad memories of Beslan with something more positive, I guess, just to see another side of the Caucasus. But also at the same time, I thought I might be able to kind of dig down a bit deeper into the deeper causes of the Beslan school siege and the general Islamist violence across the North Caucasus. And I suppose there was a third thing as well. I had always been very keen on long distance walking, and I'd done quite a bit of that in my holidays when I was at university and things. And I sort of wanted to get back to what the serendipity of those journeys that I'd made earlier on. So there was these sort of three things which came together to make me think that I would undertake this walk.
Walking is such a great way to get to know a place as well, because you sort of throw yourself on the mercy of strangers throughout the trip, and you interact in a way that you don't when you come jetting into a place and fly out or travel by bus.
I totally agree. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a lot of people talk about the therapeutic benefits of walking, and I believe in that too. It does have this wonderful kind of liquid rhythm to it and so on. But I also like the idea of it as a kind of method, as you're saying. It's a way of making yourself vulnerable, making yourself accessible to people. You kind of have to confront what's happening in front of you. You can't run away. You have to use your charm in a way. Sometimes you have to use your guile a little bit. So yeah, as a means of getting to know a place, I think it's great.
So you open the book with an epigraph by Edith Durham. Did she inspire the title?
She did, actually. Yeah, there's an short excerpt from High Albania, which is a book that Edwardian British traveller Edith Durham wrote about travelling around Albania, which happened to be her journey exactly 100 years before mine. And that's a book and a journey that I've enjoyed for years, since I got to know it 25 years ago when I travelled to Albania myself quite a bit. And so that's very much a tribute to her.
I did a podcast on Edith Durham last summer. I was hiking in the Accursed Mountains did a 10 or 12 day journey, I think it was. It struck me some of the similarities too with the Svaneti region in Georgia, the tower houses and the way the structures and the villages were formed. It looked very similar to some of the Albanian villages. Like, did they have the same history of blood feuds as you saw in the Accursed Mountains?
That's true. I mean, there's always a bit of danger of making these kind of generalizations, isn't there? But I do think there are some similarities there, definitely. There is, to some extent, a tradition of blood feud in the Caucasus. I don't think it's quite as codified as it is in Albania, with very elaborate rules, or at least in the past. But in a way, there is a similar feel of these very kind of modest stone dwellings, strong feeling of personal dignity and honor, which shouldn't be insulted. So yeah, there are, I think, some commonalities there, definitely.
Yeah, I only know of one other place in the Mani Peninsula in Greece that has tower houses like that. So it struck me as quite interesting that you only find them in these three places, as far as I know.
Right, fascinating. I didn't know that about the Mani. I guess Patrick Leigh Fermor probably wrote about that, didn't he?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, in his book on the region. So how long had you been living in Russia at the time of your journey? And did you speak Russian fluently at that point?
Yeah, I did, pretty much. I mean, I don't speak like a native Russian, of course. So I'd been there for 4 years I beg your pardon, 6 years. I arrived in Russia in 2002. So Beslan happened 2 years after I arrived, and the walk was 6 years after I arrived in Russia and been working there as a correspondent.
So you say in the book that there's no place without history. There are, however, places where history seems to cast a great shadow, and the Caucasus is one of those. I want to ask you about three key events that seem to shape the region.
Sure.
The first being the Caucasian War. You say that this was the defining moment in the history of the hitherto independent mountain peoples, most of them followers of Islam. So what happened in the Caucasus War?
Right, yeah. So, well, in the early 19th century, as the Russian Empire was expanding, and the Tsarist troops began to move beyond the line of Cossack frontier settlements that were already established on the Caucasus steppe. And there had been uprisings in Chechnya already as Russia edged southwards since probably the sort of late 1700s. And Russia was basically accusing the Highlanders of constantly raiding into Cossack territory. And so a war of conquest was launched on two fronts, basically. And, there was also obviously a much greater aspect in that the area would act for the Russian Empire as a kind of buffer against Iran and the Ottoman Empire. But this war started in earnest around 1817, and it lasted until 1864. So this was the might of the Russian Empire, the Tsarist army, taking on these small highland nations who nonetheless were very effective at fighting in the mountains. And they were led by, at least in the east of the North Caucasus, by Imam Shamil, who was a very kind of tenacious Sufi commander. And in the west, towards the Black Sea, where I began my walk, Russia was facing various Circassian tribes who didn't have a kind of unifying leader. And then separating those two focal points of the resistance was the sort of mostly peaceable Central Caucasus, where Russia had an ally in the Ossetians, who were Christians, and they controlled the road over the mountains via the Pass of the Cross into Georgia, which had joined or been coerced into joining the empire in 1801.
So would this roughly be the same time that they were pushing into Central Asia as well?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So this was all very part of a kind of a Russian expansion into what it saw as its kind of Orient, I guess. Yeah, and it had certainly an aspect of that Orientalism that we might see in, I don't know, Britain's attitudes towards India or something like that. But the interesting thing here is that Russia was expanding mostly into contiguous territory, certainly in the Caucasus at least.
Yeah, so very much the time of the Great Game then, when this whole region sort of formed a buffer zone between British India and an expansionist Russia.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's one of the reasons that, for example, the Circassians, who were fighting the Russians in the northwest Caucasus, became so cherished and loved in Europe and the States, because they were seen as being these very noble savages who were for several decades keeping off the might of the Russian Empire, but at the same time there was quite a pragmatic thing there, because they were seen as a certain sort of buffer against potential Russian encroachment on Russian British possessions in India, for example.
Yeah, these seem like quite an interesting peoples. You write in the book that in the 19th century, Russians were puzzled that the Highlanders spurned their offer of civilization, sheathed as it was in the glove of conquest, but they were also enthralled by their spirited adversaries. The Caucasus was at once savage and seductive, a stealer of hearts as well as a stealer of people, and its allure was only doubled by the train of soaring peaks and gushing torrents. So tell me a little more about the Circassians.
Yeah, that's true. So, well, they certainly were obviously seen, both the Circassians and the fighters in the eastern part of the Caucasus, the Chechens and the Avars, as primitives in a way, I suppose, from the Russian point of view. And they were seen as people who need to be dominated, who needed to have Christian culture brought to them, they needed to be put on the right path, that they were, double dealing and would stick a dagger in you at the earliest opportunity. But on the other hand, there was a kind of fascination with them, and that idea of them being the kind of noble savage that I was just mentioning, that they were indisputably great horsemen and fighters, that they were very proud, that they kind of looked magnificent in their clothes, and their weapons were wonderful. And on the frontier between the Cossacks and the peoples of the North Caucasus, there was a fairly kind of lively trade going on, and the North Caucasus Highlanders sold Cossacks weapons which they made, and so on. And the way that the Cossacks dressed, who were the frontier of the Russian advance, was very much a copy of what Highlanders looked like. So there was this very interesting mix of kind of revulsion and attraction.
So for those who don't know, or who only know the name, the Cossacks were descendants of Tatars who served as sort of a buffer between Russia and these territories.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So they were sort of kind of descendants of Tatar groups and runaway serfs who fled to Russia's borderlands, and they lived this kind of freebooting life in exchange for defending its frontiers effectively. So they were living in the northern hinterlands of the Black and the Caspian Seas. So that's now southern Ukraine and Russia. And they ran their own communities, but they also became a kind of advanced guard for territorial expansion, and that they gave their military service to the state in exchange for kind of degree of autonomy and privilege, I guess. So they were a kind of vanguard.
So would they have seen themselves as Russians, or was this sort of a loyalty they traded for to be left alone?
No, I think they did see themselves as Russians, and they obviously very much saw themselves as Orthodox Christians. Yeah, but they did have this, to Russians from further north, they were, I don't know, somehow kind of positioned between this idea of the self and the other, really. So in a way, they were kind of familiar. They were sort of Russians. They were ours, but also they were quite distant and a little bit troubling. They were kind of these slightly kind of unshackled pirates from far off shores. So in a way, they're kind of symbol of the identity crisis in Russia as a sort of place adrift between Europe and Asia.
So was the Caucasian War, was this the period when the Caucasus starts showing up in Russian literature?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's true. So there was a burgeoning Caucasus literature, and quite a lot of it was quite sort of lurid Orientalia. It was about kind of bloodthirsty warriors and dusky maidens and stuff. But the Russia's greatest writers were engaged in writing about the Caucasus: Pushkin and Lermontov and eventually Tolstoy. And there was quite an interesting trajectory there, I guess, because Pushkin was actually quite sympathetic to the Russian advance, and he wrote a poetry in which there was the Russian military leader. There was a general called Yermolov, and he had talked about how basically that the Caucasus should shake in fear in front of Russia. And Pushkin wrote about that in his poetry, saying, "Bow down your snowy head, O Caucasus, Yermolov comes." And there was a literary critic at the time who wrote to a friend a private letter saying, I can't believe that Pushkin has become this ally of bloody butchers, because the war in the Caucasus was prosecuted with a great deal of brutality against civilians. Then there was Lermontov, for example, who was a lot more ambivalent. He was actually right at the front. He fought there, and he described in the poem that he wrote, Valerik, about being in a battle and just the kind of terrible beastliness of the fight and the blood sullying the water of the river where they were standing and fighting. And then you come to Tolstoy later on, who was really, of course, he played to some of the familiar tropes about Russian aristocrats going to the Caucasus to sort of get rid of their ennui and have a great adventure. But at the same time, he was really a kind of anti-war writer and wrote about the terrible destruction of villages and so on. And he, to this day is appreciated in Chechnya, for example, because of that. There's a Tolstoy museum in Chechnya.
What do people think of a novel like A Hero of Our Time in the region? That's I think the best known one probably about this area.
Yeah, I must admit, I don't. That's not something I've ever particularly really discussed with friends there or people I know. So I'll have to say I don't know the answer to that question. I mean, I think in general, looking at that literature, people in the region are on the one hand proud. There is a great pride and martial tradition in the Caucasus. But of course, they don't like that aspect of it where they're portrayed to some extent as savages who are going to sneak down the river and put a knife in you. Who could like that? So it's an ambivalence, I guess.
It's interesting how long those types of stereotypes persist as well. Have you seen that film, Kidnapping Caucasian Style?
I have, yeah, exactly. So certainly this is really a trope that runs from the 19th century into the Soviet period and even the post-Soviet period. The idea that the Caucasus is a place where you might get kidnapped or stolen, effectively, and the sort of in Russia, in a way, there's the fear of that, but it's also slightly the thrill of the idea. I write in the book about one of the early trips I made to Chechnya and being taken up into the hills by the headman of a village there and traveling with two Russian women. And we were driving through the Argun Gorge when we suddenly heard this sort of rat-tat-tat off the cliffs and realized that it was probably some militants shooting. And the guard who was driving us stopped and got out to have a look around. And I remember that one of the young women saying, "Oh, this is where we get sold into slavery." And it was almost like a little thrill, that mixed up with the fear. So that's interesting, yeah.
There were some interesting bits of truth in the exaggerations as well in that film, like the portrayal of toasting we were just talking earlier that I was in Georgia last week, and we got caught in the rain in a village in Svaneti with some guys who happened to be under the same umbrella, and they had some cheese bread and a water cooler jug of homemade wine. And the toasting began, and
That's true.
they fire back, and the entire glass of wine goes down with every toast, and that just continues and becomes increasingly elaborate as their eyes get increasingly smaller. And the whole thing was over in
Yeah,
about 40 minutes
yeah.
because
Well,
nobody could stand up at that point.
that's true, isn't it? I mean, we all of us who've been to the Caucasus, including you now, and know that this is true. I have a friend who even has a term for it. They have a sort of firewater in Georgia called chacha, and he calls it a chacha ambush. Just making that that moment where you're just not quite expecting it, and suddenly you're in a drinking session with a bunch of people. There's always truth, a little bit of truth, in these stereotypes, isn't there? And certainly when I set off on my journey to the Caucasus, I saw quite a lot of Russian friends who they said, "Oh, you'll be a new Shurik." Shurik is the hero of the film that you mentioned, isn't he? Who goes to collect toasts in the Caucasus as a kind of folklore expedition. Yeah.
So the second event that seems to have shaped the region took place in Soviet times. Lenin's policy of indigenization. Was that responsible for creating the ethnic republics that we know today?
Well, it was certainly responsible. This was in the 1920s and the 1930s when Lenin had the idea that certain kind of Russian chauvinism needed to be eroded inside this new Soviet empire. And the way to do that was a kind of affirmative action where they would give regional elites more power on their territories, where there would be more teaching of local languages, the kind of institutionalizing of ethnicity in the state infrastructure. And that was pursued, for some way through the 20s and into the early 30s. And, in a way, it probably had quite a sort of positive effect for a lot of those peoples. But eventually, Stalin came to the idea, I think, that rapid industrialization was much more important priority, and that really nationality should be kind of dissolved into Soviet man who was going to produce this great leap forward. So there was a kind of reversal of korenizatsia, which means indigenization, basically putting down roots. In the end, in the late 30s, collectivization had kicked in. That was something which was particularly abhorrent to people in the mountains. So, having animals, livestock expropriated, and horses and things, especially for people with great pride in their horse riding tradition. So there was some resistance to that. And these smaller nations began to be kind of labeled as being rather dangerous, in fact, and kind of potentially kind of bourgeois opponents to the regime and so on. In the end, we saw during the Second World War, there was a deportation of several of these nations in the North Caucasus who were deported en masse to Central Asia as a punishment for supposedly collaborating with the invading Nazis, which was only true to a very small extent, a certain number of partisans.
Yeah, so that was the third great kind of a historical event that I had wanted to ask you about that seemed to have shaped things. Like, so the Lenin's collectivization was a way to sort of inoculate people against more virulent forms of nationalism and dissuade them from seeking ties to troublesome diasporas, in a sense. And then Stalin comes along and says, no, this small independent communities is not what we want at all. We have to eradicate all tradition and make a sort of Soviet technological man, and starts to wipe this out. And these mass relocations seem to scar the regions even to this day. Like, how much of the strife that we see in the Caucasus today comes down to, in part, to these relocations?
That's a very good question. Yeah, I mean, my feeling is that these things reverberate down through the generations, and that there's a big problem here, and that Russia never really dealt with these things or processed them in that word that we might use now. We probably think, don't we, that Germany, to some extent, has confronted its awful past with the Holocaust and so on, and there has been a kind of processing and dealing with that. But if we look at Russia, very sadly, things like this, I think, have not been dealt with, have not been processed. And for that reason, the hurt and the resentment that were caused by them tends to repeat itself. It lives on. I mean, just to remind you, what we're talking about here is the fact that several Caucasus nations, the Karachais, the Bulgars, the English, the Chechens. These are not huge nations, several 100,000 people, but they were deported en masse. They were loaded onto Studebaker trucks, which had been provided to the Soviet Union under the American Lend-Lease program, and they were employed in this terrible act of domestic tyranny. People were loaded into trucks. They were taken to cattle wagons and dispatched to Central Asia, taking several weeks to get there. Elderly people, children, everybody. Not given very much food, no toilets, obviously, on the train. People dying in the carriages and taken out and left on the sides by the railway. A huge number of people died on that journey and in the early days of being brought to Central Asia, where they lived in terrible conditions. And then they weren't allowed to return home for about 13 years. And obviously these people left not knowing if they'll ever see their homes again. They had to abandon their livestock. People who had probably grown up with a very kind of a close relationship with the land, with their immediate vicinity, with their village, torn away from it. So there had been this idea of korenizatsia, putting down roots. And this is exactly the opposite. This is what we call deracination, isn't it? Which means exactly tearing out of roots. And this is a kind of trauma which just doesn't go away, really. I mean, it is marked there at a local level. Everybody knows about it. Every person from those nations knows the history. But these things kind of don't go away. So when we come to the 1990s and we see the conflict in Chechnya, of course, there are very immediate reasons for why that happened, political reasons about the spread of Islamism. The social scientists would explore those very specific reasons, but you also have to remember that there's this much greater kind of background throbbing hurt from these historical traumas. And someone like Shamil Basayev, who was the Chechen terrorist leader, the Islamist, who was the architect of Beslan, even though he wasn't present, he had talked about the fact that the deportation of the Chechen people was one reason why he was so motivated to fight against Russia and to bring terror to Russian citizens. So you do very much get the feeling that these things like the mass expulsion of the Circassians in the 19th century, which was also done with terrible brutality, and the deportations and so on, that these things just are part of a cycle of violence, very sadly, and that may even continue to be true, especially if they're never properly kind of dealt with and confronted by wider Russian society.
Well, you can understand why they would have difficulty trusting the Russian government or whoever has taken over the regime next when you go from Lenin's policy of encouraging these ethnic nationalities to express their own culture to this mass deportation, 600,000 people dumped into Central Asia, and then they're allowed to come home again under the next leader, under Khrushchev. You can see why they would mistrust anything coming from the central authority.
That's very true, of course, yeah, and these led to other conflicts because people came home and found that their homes had been occupied by people of other ethnicity, other groups, or people had been deliberately moved into their homes. So that exacerbated ethnic tensions between different groups within Russia, had a very destructive and continuing effect.
Yeah, I found this passage on the Soviet legacy really interesting. You say that there's a common misunderstanding that the USSR deep froze ancient enmities between nations, hatreds that thawed and sparked once it was gone, kind of like what people say about Yugoslavia after Tito. But in fact, the communist system incubated many of the bloody conflicts of the 90s, particularly in the Caucasus, by promoting ethnic elites, granting them symbols and political power on defined territories, tools that nationalists used to rally support in the vacuum after the Soviet collapse. So this power vacuum happens, and then all these nationalities spring back to life again, which were always there but suppressed under later leaders.
Yes, right. I mean, I'm obviously not a historian. I'm not an expert on this, but I have a certain feeling that before the Russian expansion into the North Caucasus, there was, of course, conflict between the different peoples there, but there were also many examples of living together. And these things that happened in the Tsarist and Soviet period just had a very corrosive effect, unfortunately. So we see conflicts like the Ingush-Ossetian conflict. So between the Muslim Ingush who live in Ingushetia, the republic just to the west of Chechnya, and Ossetians in North Ossetia, where Beslan is situated, a conflict broke out there in the early 1990s, which was a direct result of these manipulations of boundaries and movement of people and deportations and so on. that's very sad. And once those ethnic conflicts have begun, then they have their own momentum as well. Sadly, they it's very difficult, and to bring people back together, the pernicious effect is very long lasting.
Well, you started your walk in one of these regions of territorial conflict, not in Russia, but in Abkhazia, the territory that broke away from Georgia. Why did you decide to start there when you were walking across Russia proper?
Partly because I was just fascinated by Abkhazia, I guess, but it's because Abkhazia has, even though it's south of the mountains, Abkhazia is an area of Georgia which broke away in the 1990s. There's another ethnic conflict, effectively. The Georgian population had to flee, and then Abkhazia declared itself independent. So it's a de facto independent republic, even though it's not really recognized by anyone much. But its people have quite strong connections with those on the north side of the mountains. So especially with the Circassians in the northwest Caucasus. So in a way, it's sort of, in some respects, an honorary part of the North Caucasus, as is South Ossetia. These two breakaway regions of Georgia, which have strong ties across the mountain divide.
One memorable encounter in that part of your book was a visit to Stalin's dacha. His legacy is stamped all over the region, but the feelings about him vary quite widely. So even when he's recognized as a monster, he still seems to be looked up to as a big man. I saw the same thing in Georgia last week. Tell us about the legacy of Stalin today.
That's true. I mean, although I'd say, obviously in Georgia, he's still lauded by many, and there's a Stalin museum there, isn't there? Which is also quite laudatory, as I remember, if it's still there.
Yes, yeah. Well, they changed they've watered it down very slightly now.
Okay, have they? I didn't know.
The whole thing is quite a hagiography. Like it deals with Stalin's early life, his early revolutionary activities in Georgia. Huge focus on the Second World War, with a lot of photos of tractor factories in between then, and agricultural cooperatives.
Yeah.
And then suddenly his death mask, and that's it. And here's the Hall of Gifts that he was given, but no mention of any of the show trials. Not a single photo of Beria, which was interesting. Really? His fellow Georgian.
Yeah.
And then at the end, I overheard one of the guides saying, "Well, if you want to hear the negative side of some of these events, there's a museum about the KGB's activities in Lithuania and in Latvia, so you can go there to hear that side, or you can go over here for this other bit. But this is only about the positive side." So very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I think, but among the deported peoples, he's universally loathed because he's seen as the architect of that. Mm-hmm. So among Karachais and Balkars and English and Chechens, they just hate him. I talked to a Karachai survivor of the deportations, and he was still shaking with rage when he was talking about Stalin and Beria, and that's, however long it was, 60 years after he'd been deported. So there's certainly no sympathy there. But elsewhere in the Caucasus, Stalin is held up. In the North Caucasus, even, he is still held up as a sort of tough, uncompromising, heroic leader. I guess I saw that especially in Dagestan. I've been to a couple of villages there where there are busts of Stalin. Why is that? I'm not sure that I really know. Maybe it is a bit of a cult of a strong man there. There perhaps is a little bit of Schadenfreude towards Chechens and other people, the ones who were deported. I mean, I did speak to one man in Dagestan, I remember, who said, "Oh, the Chechens should have been pushed into the sea, just like Beria wanted." Beria, Stalin's henchman. And there have been some territorial disputes between Dagestan and Chechnya as well, so maybe that's part of the story. But it's an intriguing phenomenon that, on the one hand, there are people who detest him very rightly, but on the other, there are some who still love and admire him, and perhaps that's not so surprising when that's a wider phenomenon across Russia itself.
Well, even within the same person, sometimes you found contradictions. Like you talked about a Gulag survivor in the far north of Russia who slaved for years in a coal mine and slept in a bunker that she and the other inmates had to dig out of the ground on their own. And he asked, did she blame Stalin for her suffering? She said, no, he didn't know about my imprisonment. The system was to blame, not Stalin. He was trying to do the right thing.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? Yeah. I think I was reflecting on that moment when I had met a Russian Orthodox priest who was living at a monastery in Abkhazia, and he had talked about his own admiration for Stalin, and I blurted out, "Well, he murdered thousands of priests, you know." But the Russian priest, I'm sorry, he wasn't a priest; he was a monk actually. Said, "But yes, but he was a great patriot, you know, and his attitudes changed. And when the Nazis were nearing Moscow, he had people parade around the city with icons. Um, so these can be quite contradictory feelings living in one person, can't they? I mean, just to imagine that a man of religion like that talking about the leader of a country that just tried to destroy religion, that killed priests and melted down church bells and destroyed buildings, and that turned the very monastery where this monk was living into a holiday camp. So that's quite extraordinary that you do meet those contradictory feelings in a single person.
Another man called Arcady too. So he said, you quoted him saying, "You could say what you like. I saw myself on TV what he left behind when he died. 15 cups, one of them chipped. You know, nothing. Like he didn't enrich himself. So therefore he had worked for the people selflessly all this time."
That's right. I mean, that's another aspect of the idea of Stalin, isn't it? That he was this ascetic guy in his kind of slightly shabby tunic.
In terms of the hike itself, navigation seemed to be a constant issue. Was that the greatest challenge? The paths just vanishing into the forest all the time and trying to make your way across this relatively trackless region?
Mm-hmm. Well, it was certainly one of them. I mean, you know, I'd done quite a lot of walking in the past, but I've never been someone who's really interested in hiking as a sport. I'm someone who likes walking as I was saying, I think a bit like a kind of method, a way of meeting people and being on the ground, as it were. So I probably wasn't as fully prepared as I should have been. I mean, I have got some map and compass skills, but maybe not quite as good as they should be. So, and especially in the beginning in the Northwest Caucasus, the navigation was quite hard because it's very heavily forested there. You know, there's much heavier rainfall in the Northwest Caucasus than in, for example, the dry, rugged highlands in Dagestan in the northeast. So you're walking through very thick forest, and it can be just quite difficult to find your way. So I did get lost on a few occasions, actually. But you know, that can be not such a bad thing. Getting lost you sometimes end up meeting interesting people or being in a situation you didn't anticipate, and that makes the thing all the more fascinating.
Yeah, nothing interesting happens when you're found. It's always when you get lost that the best stories happen.
That's probably.
But you also said you expected to encounter more people on foot in the mountains. But while there was life in the valleys and the mountains, you didn't even find shepherds quite a lot of the time.
No, well, I did. In the Central Caucasus, actually, shepherds were the people who I kind of did meet more often than not, but not many other people. You know, I had expected there would be more people trekking. Maybe I was just unlucky, or maybe that's just the way it worked out. That there's, you know, the trekking tradition was extremely strong in the Soviet Union. There were huge parties of walkers tramping through the mountains all the time. You know, they went on these organized trips, maybe, you know, which would be arranged by a factory or something, or by the Komsomol or whatever. And that did continue in the 90s and the 2000s, and even now, I think. But I guess at the time when I did my walk, it probably had tailed off quite a bit because of the fact that the Islamist insurgency was still going on in the North Caucasus, which had grown out of these wars for independence in Chechnya in the late 90s and early 2000s. So probably there were more groups who might, you know, like pure mountaineers who are going to the very high peaks, but less people who are just trekking like me, because there's not really much infrastructure left. I quite enjoyed that in a sense. I did have that kind of slightly special feeling that I was getting off the beaten track and being somewhere quite special.
That's another thing that surprised me about this region, just how high some of these peaks are. I mean, they make the Alps look like foothills quite often. They're just massive. I was hiking last week. I got up to around 10,000 feet, so 9,900 meters, and the peaks just towered above me. Like this is serious mountaineering territory in alpine hiking. But
yeah, absolutely, yeah, and there, you know, if you consider the Caucasus to be Europe, and most people do, you know, there are, I think, a dozen odd peaks which are higher than Mont Blanc, and Elbrus is obviously the highest mountain in Europe. And certainly the British climbers who were the pioneers in the Alps in the 19th century, once they had kind of, in a way, finished there, they moved on to the Caucasus, and they were incredibly impressed by the sheer grandeur of it in comparison to the Alps. And of course, the Alps is wonderful, but they really felt they'd seen something quite different when they arrived in the Caucasus in terms of the sheer vastness of the peaks and the great troughs between them and the glaciers. And
You can understand why this region would spawn such interesting mixes of ethnicities and small villages cut off from each other in these massive peaks. That was the other thing that really stood out for me too. You say that in Dagestan, for example, you hiked without a tent or bedding, but every night without fail, a stranger would take you in. That the hospitality of the people really stands out from this trip.
absolutely, yeah, that was extraordinary, yeah. And Dagestan is different to that Central Caucasus part that I was talking about just now, with the High Caucasus part where the high pastures and shepherds and the villages are quite a bit lower down. Dagestan is this whole kind of upland which is just full of tiny little villages, or not so tiny, in fact. It's the mountains there are very populated. And before I set out, I had a meeting with a minister of tourism of Dagestan, and he said, "Oh, don't worry about taking a tent. You just turn up in the village every night and say, could I speak to the school teacher or the head of the village, and ask them if you could stay the night, and then that will be fine." And I was like, "No, surely that can't be." And he said, "No, no, that'll be fine." And that's exactly what happened. And every time I would turn up in the village with a companion I was walking with, Suleiman, a Dagestani, a Dargin, and I would say, we'd be very happy to pay to stay the night somewhere. Please let us do that, and we'll pay for the food as well. And every time, everybody said, "No, of course not. That's absolutely without question that you'll just come and stay with me right now." The first person you spoke to. So, and that's pretty incredible, to think about the fact that we were traveling through those mountains carrying rucksacks. There's pretty much no one just walking through Dagestan. I mean, there might be people out again up in the high peaks mountaineering, but just walking through Dagestan was very unusual at that point, I think. And they could have easily suspected that we were militants or been suspicious. And I think there was one occasion when the headman of the village says, "No, I don't really know who you might be. You could be come to help the militants or something." And there was another man from the village who immediately kind of threw himself forward and to save the honor of the village and said, "No, come and stay with us then." These are people who have been accused down through history as being uncivilized, and this is obviously, we found something quite different.
How much resistance did you have from officially, like from the Russian government, for example? Were you quite free to travel through some of these regions, given the propensity for violence around that time period?
In the Central Caucasus, where I was going over slightly higher passes, I had to have permits because I was going, as I remember, it's because it's in a border zone quite close to the border with Georgia. So I did acquire these permits in advance, and the border guards, who are part of the Federal Security Service, the FSB in Russia, would check up on me. But they were actually helpful as well. They were kind of helping point the way and giving me some tips and things. They kept sort of turning up quite often and kind of almost like jumping out from behind bushes. Not quite, but it felt a bit like that. So I wasn't quite sure if they were kind of keeping tabs on me, or if they were actually, on the contrary, really keen to be helpful, or a bit of both, really. It was quite curious. Later in Dagestan, it was a bit fraught on occasion, because I think people were really a bit suspect of suspicious of what we were doing there. And it was kind of so strange to see people trudging around with rucksacks. And I think a couple of the policemen there were a bit suspicious that we were kind of carrying big bags of dollars to give to the militants or something. There was also an occasion where I had marked on a map the places where I had noted that there had been some incident of Islamist violence, because I thought I'd avoid these places. But one of the kind of police or security guys who stopped me was like, "What's this map? Is this your kind of drop-off points for your, meetings with the militants or something?" So I had to sort of try and explain that away. And I did get detained on a couple of occasions and questioned. That happened early in the trip in Abkhazia as well.
That was quite interesting. So also the fact that when you were crossing the border into Abkhazia, they immediately pulled up a file and said, "Well, you've written about us before," and they didn't quite like an article you had published some years previously.
Actually, that's quite right. That was, in fact, the moment when I got detained, because I'd gone myself to ask permission from the security service there to travel to a remote village in the highlands, because supposedly you needed permission to go there. And they kind of, as soon as I got there, they kind of got their talons in me and said, "You're a spy. What are you doing here?" I was trying to say, well, if I was a spy, I'd hardly show up here, would I?
Yeah,
Um,
that's your cunning ruse, obviously.
yeah. Anyway, so they ended up kind of interrogating me for several hours. It was pretty unpleasant. But on the other hand, maybe they were just playing with me a bit because they didn't like this article that I'd written a few years earlier. You never quite know whether they really think you're a spy or whether it's just kind of fun to play with you a bit, to find got a chance to get their revenge on you for writing these articles, kind of disparaging the place or whatever. So yeah, but what I should say is overall, the whole trip was an immensely positive experience in terms of hospitality and help. I can't imagine it people being so helpful anywhere else in the world, really. Maybe Albania.
Was that what you expected when you set out?
I guess I had some expectation of that, having already been there and worked there for a few years, but just the extent of it was pretty extraordinary, really, and especially those final 3 weeks in Dagestan, which was supposed to be, or was, the kind of the heart of the Islamist insurgency, where people had a right to be suspicious of, people turning up unannounced, looking for somewhere to stay the night. Nonetheless, we were treated in an incredibly kind of kind and solicitous way.
I wanted to ask you about a couple of specific republics you passed through. Like, as if to underline the long history of conflict in the region, you stumbled across a war on your hike.
That's true. Yeah, that's true. So I just come from. I'd been in Beslan. I'd come down from the mountains because it wasn't possible to walk further through the mountains. After Beslan, after the school siege, there were various rules brought in, which mean you could only move around if you're a foreigner on certain main roads. So I had to walk down from the mountains and walk along the road. And I came into North Ossetia, went to Beslan, and then walked on to Vladikavkaz, which is the capital of North Ossetia. And just as I arrived there, I got and found a little hotel room to stay in, switched on the TV, and there was kind of shooting, tracer fire, artillery on the. And I sort of thought very lazily to myself, "Oh, that's some conflict away in Africa or something." And no, it turned out that it was war had just broken out literally on the other side of the mountains in South Ossetia, and Georgia had launched an attempt to take back its breakaway region of South Ossetia, and Russia was preparing to get involved because it props up South Ossetia in the same way as it does Abkhazia, and Cossacks and other militiamen from Russia were gathering in Vladikavkaz where I was, and very soon Russian tanks were going through the tunnel under the mountains to support the Ossetians against the Georgians. So it sort of felt like I'd walked into a war, basically. And I actually ended up taking a break from the walk and going back to my job of being a correspondent. My editors asked me if I could go there and report on the conflict because I was right there at the moment it began. But that was, as you say, it did kind of underline, sadly, the potentially kind of fractious nature of the region.
Ossetia seems quite a different kettle of fish to the other republics as well. You mentioned that that it's Christian and it was sort of an ally of Russia. How did that come about when the rest of the region was basically Islamic republics? Well, first of all, was that because of the Ottomans? Did they spread Islam to those regions, those other regions?
Well, so it's partly under Ottoman and Iranian Persian influence. Yeah, and I mean, I'm afraid again, I'm not a professional historian, but the Ossetians have been Christians going back to I think the 18th century, the late 18th century, and for that reason, they were kind of logical allies for the Russians, also Orthodox Christians. I mean, that said, there's a incredible kind of mashing up of traditional, I guess, what we used to call pagan belief and Christian beliefs in Ossetia, and those traditional beliefs are still persist now. They have interesting rituals there with sacrifices of animals and so on. They eat traditional pies, which are in the shape of the sun and things like that. So there's a very interesting mixture of tradition and religion, but that quite early conversion to Christianity that was struck, I guess, under the influence of Christian missionaries from Russia and earlier perhaps from Georgia. Yeah, that did mean that that Ossetia was a kind of natural ally for Russia, and because of the positioning of the Ossetian people living on both sides of the mountains. They were a kind of natural bridgehead from the North Caucasus to Georgia, which had joined or kind of been coerced into joining the Russian Empire in 1801. So throughout this war, the Caucasian War of Russia advancing into the Caucasus and fighting these Muslim highlanders, Russia did have this bridgehead via the Ossetians over the Pass of the Cross, which we mentioned earlier, into Georgia. So it separated the fight into two fronts, and that was very helpful, I guess.
I suppose the republic that most outsiders have heard of in this region was Chechnya. Was Chechnya the most dangerous part of the route?
That's hard to say, I guess. Perhaps it was Chechnya, Ingushetia, and Chechnya and Dagestan, the last three republics, mostly because the Islamist insurgency there was most determined, and the security forces were clashing with these militants, trying to track them down. So, principal perhaps danger was just getting caught in the crossfire by bad luck as much as anything else. Potentially just having problems with the security services, or, by that time as well, the militants had really kind of become locked into a kind of global jihad. So as well as fighting the Russians, militants in the North Caucasus were also buying into that fight against the Western world as well, I guess, or they're at least being allied with people abroad who were involved in that fight. So, it could have been pretty unpleasant if I'd fallen into some militant hands, potentially. Yeah, so there was a degree of danger, and perhaps Dagestan, perhaps Chechnya.
So you'd been there in the past as a journalist and met Kadyrov. What were your impressions of him?
Yeah, so this is Ramzan Kadyrov, who's the pro-Kremlin leader of Chechnya, and he's still now, and he was then. I actually met him in 2006, shortly before he became the leader of Chechnya. He's the son of Akhmat Kadyrov, who was a kind of Russian placeman in Chechnya who got assassinated. And so he ended up taking over his father's role. So Ramzan as well as well as his father, they were former rebels who had been fighting against Russia, and then they came across to the Russian side. Well, what can you say about Kadyrov? I mean, basically, what happened was that there was a kind of Faustian pact, and Kadyrov was allowed to cultivate Chechnya as his own fiefdom, where he could basically do whatever he liked, in exchange for him rubbing out the Islamist insurgency with using whatever brutal methods he wanted to. So, and he was, in the end, quite effective in that. Eventually the resistance, the insurgency in the North Caucasus effectively got stamped out. And that's partly a result of what Kadyrov managed to achieve. But the cost of that was enormous because, Chechnya was effectively allowed to turn into a mini dictatorship inside already authoritarian or autocratic Russia. And he then and now acts with complete impunity, if he decides he doesn't like gay people, he can have them kidnapped and killed. If he doesn't like people being politically opposed to him, something awful can happen to them. So this culture, this Chechnya, which actually has a very long egalitarian tradition of people not being raised above each other or not having that kind of strongman leader at all, has become this kind of extraordinary dictatorship in this corner of Russia, and it's just left alone to flourish like that, which is a great tragedy, really. I mean, of course, there are people there who, and they have their right to that opinion, of course, feel that even what is happening now is better than having bombs raining down all the time, carpet bombing and terrible destruction. Chechnya has been rebuilt somewhat shoddily in places, but it is a functioning place. It's just a terrible dictatorship, and you can't put your head above the parapet if you're in any way against what Kadyrov's thinking. Some people who kind of in agreement with him will say that life is much better there.
What was your impression of him as a person when you're in the same room with him?
I mean, I could see that he had a certain charisma. He was very convinced about his religious belief. I was there when he and his family members and friends were performing a Sufi ritual called zikr. what can I say? I mean, I can only talk about how he behaved. Perhaps, he had a tiger and a lion which he brought out to show us, and he was goading them and spitting on them in order to try and get them to retaliate. He had his squad of personal bodyguards at his home come out and march around in front of us, a whole squad of them, 50 odd men, I guess, while he was shouting Allahu Akbar at them and they were replying. I guess I can judge him by what I know has happened in Chechnya under his rule, and that's the fact that many people have been kidnapped and tortured or simply disappeared. He's obviously a very brutal guy.
You mentioned that he was performing a Sufi ritual. How common is Sufism in the region, in the North Caucasus?
Well, no, that's still predominant in Chechnya and in Dagestan. Yeah, and it's seen there as what they would call traditional Islam in opposition to Wahhabism, which is the name generally used for radical Muslims, especially those involved in violence. Salafis is another term that's used. Yeah, I think that's a bit of a false opposition in a way, because there are Salafis there who are actually quite peaceful, but people who are observers of more conservative strains of Islam, or who might go to the sort of wrong mosques, quite easily become painted as extremists and potential militants, even if they've had nothing to do with it.
So he's sort of an example of collaboration with Russia, or the current leadership of Russia, but no one seems to symbolize resistance to Russia better than Imam Shamil. Tell us about him. He's quite an amazing character.
That's true. Yeah, he's an extraordinary character. So he was the leader of the Chechen and Dagestani resistance to Russia in the 19th century Caucasian War from 1817 to 1864. He's an Avar. That's one of the many ethnicities in Dagestan. Dagestan is this incredible jumble of ethnicities, at least 30 odd. One of the larger ones is the Avars. And he turned out to be basically a terrific fighter and managed to hold off the Russian Empire for several decades, fighting quite often from these mountain villages with kind of guerrilla tactics. And he was a Sufi leader as well. So he had this kind of mystic aura to him, as well as being a very effective military man. He fought on for many decades, but eventually had to capitulate in 1859. The Russian Empire used a very clever tactic in a way that it began to decimate forests in Chechnya and Dagestan, and that meant there were less hiding places for the guerrilla Highlander resistance, and they had to retreat to the high mountains. And eventually, he got kind of cornered in one of them with only a few hundred fighters left in a village called Gunib, which I went to on my journey, and he was forced to surrender. But interestingly, he was kind of treated like a fallen head of state, even though he'd been portrayed as this kind of primitive villain. He was allowed to be. He was taken off to the Russian city of Kaluga, and he was given a nice house to live in with a little mosque in the back garden. He was respected. He was allowed to meet kind of local dignitaries. He was kind of, and he had several of his wives and sons with him. He was given a fairly comfortable lifestyle, and eventually he was allowed to go off on the Hajj to Mecca, and he ended up dying while he was on that. But he's again a kind of an interesting example of how Russia was both repulsed but also quite attracted by a character from the Caucasus.
As we come to the end, I wanted to mention a couple people you encountered whose story stayed with me. One sort of felt like a symbol of the region's independence, and the other of its depth of memory and its reverence for the past. Mm-hmm. So tell us about the man who built the road single-handedly.
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting story too. So that was towards the end of my journey when I came to a village called Kubachi in Dagestan, which is well known historically as being a place where silversmiths work. It's quite a large, prosperous village. There's a silver making little factory there where they make goblets and jewelry and things like that. And I met the head of the village, a guy called Gaji Issa. And so much of my journey I'd had to confront these quite traumatic and kind of bloody things that had happened in the past and in the not too distant past in the Caucasus. But they were several moments, where I met these people I felt were completely inspirational. And Gadjiosa had done something extraordinary. So he in his village, there were various traders who wanted to get to the local market town. And he said that basically it was too far away. It was 15, 20 miles away. I don't remember how much exactly, because they had to go a very circuitous route on the main road. And he said, so I thought I'll build my own road. I'll build them a road so they can get quicker to market. And he gathered together 4 or 5 friends. They managed to get a bulldozer from some friendly politician. And they just set out to build a road through the mountains, through a forest, through a gorge. And they started out on this project blithely, just a handful of them. Never, they're not professional road builders or anything. They just used dynamite and the bulldozer and everything. And little by little, their friends lost interest until only Gadjiosa was left with this project. It's like something from a poem or from a saga or something. And so he just carried on his own, building a road, one man to build a road. And it took another couple of years, as I remember, for him to do it. I say a road, of course, it's a dirt path, but it's, you could go along it in a car. So he had to clear the trees, and he would lie out at night under the stars with the rain dripping down his neck, and then get up and start putting his dynamite in holes again. And he achieved it. He built the road to connect his village with the market town. So I just felt that was such an extraordinary achievement.
That's amazing. Yeah, such a symbol of ingenuity and determination.
Exactly the word. Yeah, that's right, Ryan. Yeah, absolutely.
The other guy that really stuck with me, you met a man living alone in a deserted village, keeping the memory of that place alive. And he said, I'm completely alone. Every morning I get up and I walk around the village. I go down the central street, see if any walls have fallen. Sometimes I cut nettles with a scythe. And when I'm passing the houses, I recall the names of the families who lived there, and I say their names to myself, not to forget. So this sense of the depth of history and the reverence for memory in these places came across really strongly.
Yeah, that's true. I'm afraid I momentarily can't remember the gentleman's name, but that felt to me incredibly poignant, especially that moment when he talked about the fact that he spoke aloud the names of the people there in order not to forget. That really struck home for me. This is a village in Highland Dagestan from which people had been forcibly, as I understand it, moved to Chechnya to populate one of the villages that was emptied by the deportations. And it was a village, the one in Dagestan, which had been built up with fearful effort over the decades and centuries, in fact, where people had lived there in the past, high up in the mountains, very difficult to get to, having to build houses, mostly by hand with stone and so on. So by the time they came back, whatever it was, 15 years later or something, there was just no way really of building it back up again, or it would have been such a huge effort that by that time people were more attracted to go and live in the city. So the village where this man had grown up just was left to founder, really. And he had gone away himself to live in the town and then come back only recently to be the kind of caretaker, because there's a mausoleum there, and it's a very special place in a religious sense where pilgrims come. So he just lived up there in the mountains on his own, and looked after it and greeted people who trekked up there to see the mausoleum and so on, and a beautiful mosque. But this was the place where he'd lived as a child, so he talked about the fact he remembered people laughing and talking and arguing and the clamor of life, basically. I think the phrase that he told me at the end was, it's a very strange thing where the place where you grew up becomes a museum, So again, that was very poignant, I thought. And that was something which had kind of reverberated through my experience in my book, was this idea of being forcibly removed from your home and then coming back and thinking, can you really replace what's been lost?
That's what really stayed with me throughout. After closing the last page of the book, not so much the trauma at the beginning and the horrible things you witnessed or the violence that the region is known for, but this sense. And in closing, you said, this is a book about resilience as much as the hauntings of history. So many times on my walk, I met people who were surviving, even thriving on the stoniest of ground. To see a shepherd crouched in his cosh on a wild Caucasus slope, his face lit by a fire like a medieval anchorite, is to feel a sense of permanence on earth. The deep roots of the people in this region, their traditions, and these proud, hospitable cultures. That's what stayed with me afterwards. So it's a really remarkable read and a fantastic book, and I hope it does well, and I hope listeners will pick it up. So thank you very much, Tom, for your time today.
Thank you very much, Ryan. It's been an enormous pleasure to talk to you, and thank you for taking such an interest.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Personal Landscapes. If you like the podcast, please give it a rating on iTunes and subscribe through your favorite app. You can find links to today's podcast and more conversations on Books About Place at ryanmurdoch.com. You'll also find a donate button if you'd like to contribute to the costs of the show. All donations are greatly appreciated.